So do you know the definition of a masochist? Somebody who comes back for another Bible study. Okay, so tonight, lesson 2, unit 2, Jesus before the Jewish authorities. So last week, just to refresh, we talked about the agony in the garden. We talked about Jesus' prayer and Jesus' arrest. We said that Jesus' prayer in the garden, from the synoptic perspective, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus prays to be relieved of the cup that the Father wants him to drink, but that the Father's will should be done. The arrest of Jesus was triggered by Judas, and we talked about the cutting off of the servant's ear. Somebody asked me last week, I think it was here Wednesday night, or maybe it was Tuesday morning, about that line in John's text where they ask him, Jesus says, "Who are you here for?" They say, "Jesus of Nazareth," or "Jesus the Nazarene," and they say, "I am he," and they fell down. Somebody had asked me about that, and so, and I think the explanation I gave was one of the explanations is that it was a mockery, it was a fake worship, it was a fake honoring, because obviously if they knew he was the Son of God, they would have crucified him, okay? But I did a little further digging, and there's another commentator that says that the actual Greek text says they were forced backward and fell to the ground. So it wasn't of their own volition that they were doing it. They were forced backwards somehow and fell to the ground because they were forced backwards. The implication being that, remember this is John's gospel, that Jesus said the holy name. He said, Yahweh, I am. And the power of the holy name is such that it makes people fall down. There's a power in the pronouncing of the holy name. And that even those who were induced by Satan, like Judas who's standing there, fall down in the name of God. So that was another explanation. There's no one that you have to believe. There's no one you can't believe. So you can, whichever one of those that you want to buy into, it's completely up to you. Okay? So that was last week. This week, we are going to do a little more geography. We're going to talk tonight about the leaders of the Jewish leaders of the people, and then make some comments on the reading assignments we have for today. So again, just to reorient ourselves, this is that model of the city of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. So there's the wall all the way around the city. This is the Temple Mount area. Okay, remember here's that golden gate, what it looked like in Jesus' time. Here's the temple itself. Remember the back side of this retaining wall on this side, if you go on the other side, that's the western wall or the Wailing Wall. You have over here the Fortress Antonia, which we'll be talking some more about. Back over here where these towers are, this is the palace of Herod. And then over here, back by the wall, is the house of Caiaphas. Okay? So remember, this area here is the Kidron River Valley coming down from the Temple Mount. So this is a slope right here. This is coming down to the dried up river valley called the Kidron Valley. We talked about that last week. And then coming to the other side is the Mount of Olives. So Jesus was arrested last week at the base of the Mount of Olives. They brought him across the Kidron Valley back into one of the gates, presumably somewhere in here, in this area of the wall. They brought him back through the gates, and they brought him to, as we're going to hear, Caiaphas' house, which is back here. Okay? So just to kind of reorient you to the geography. David.
I was wondering, can you show where Solomon's portico is?
I don't remember exactly, I'm sorry. Sorry. I could look that up for next week, but I don't remember off the top of my head. Okay, so the geography of the Passion. So we took Jesus from the Garden of Gethsemane to the house of Caiaphas. This area in here is where the house of Caiaphas was, close to the city wall. These, by the way, are steps that today lead up towards where the house of Caiaphas once stood. It's most likely that these weren't the actual stones that Jesus walked on, but these were the stones that lead up there today to where the house of Caiaphas once stood. Okay. And then you've got here, so on the place where Caiaphas' house once stood, there's now a Roman Catholic church. It's called St. Peter in Gallicantu. Any Latin scholars here? Galle means the cock, the rooster. Cantu is the verb tense of singing. It's where the cock crowed. So the church built on this site is really cleverly named. What should we call this church where we built where Peter denied Jesus and the cock crowed? I know, let's call it the Church of Peter and the cock crowing. Pretty clever, huh? It sounds nicer in Latin, St. Peter and Gallicantu. So in the Church of St. Peter and Gallicantu, there's a triptych icon. So it's 3 icons put together telling a story. And it's the story of Jesus and St. Peter. And one of those panels is this panel right here, where Peter, here dressed in gold because he's a bishop, and in iconography, bishops are always dressed in gold. And Jesus, who's got his hands tied, who's been arrested, are looking at each other. We'll talk about this scene in a few more minutes. And then over here, there's this column, and there's St. Peter sitting here, and there's 3 people around him representing the 3 people he denied, to whom he denied knowing Jesus. And so this is right outside the Church of St. Peter in Gallicantu, because that's where Peter would have been outside in the courtyard of Caiaphas' house, where he was denying that he knew Jesus. Okay. So just a couple of things there that you can see. Okay. So when we talk about the leaders of the people, so it occurred to me yesterday that we can talk about these groups very similar to the way we would talk about, let's say, for example, on Congress. Okay? So there's different words that get thrown out. Sanhedrin, chief priests, high priests, elders, scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, zealots. And I would guess that some of those, at least for all of us, we may not be clear on what those words mean. They get used in the gospel all the time. The scribes and the Pharisees, or the chief priests and the elders, or and it's like, well, who are these people? What does that mean? Okay, so I thought I would spend some time tonight talking about who these different groups are. So the first word we're going to come to is the Sanhedrin. So the Sanhedrin literally means the assembly. Okay. So who is this? What is the Sanhedrin? The Sanhedrin is the assembly of all of the leaders of the Jewish authorities at this time. Now remember when I say Jewish authorities, because who's really in charge of this area? The Romans, okay? Julius Caesar and Pompey and all these people conquered this area. It's under Roman authority, but they leave some Jewish leadership in place. So there is an assembly of leaders called the Sanhedrin. Now sometimes in the text, you almost don't know when it's happening, almost. But the assembly of leaders, there's the big full Sanhedrin, and then there's like little baby Sanhedrins. Okay? So not all of the whole Sanhedrin necessarily is present every time the word the Sanhedrin is used. Okay? It's kind of like we would have, if you're familiar with how Congress works, the House of Representatives can meet as the House of Representatives, but they also might meet as a committee of the whole. Okay? And then there's subcommittees and all those kinds of things in the House of Representatives. But when a committee meets, we might just say the House of Representatives said. That's the same way they'll use the word Sanhedrin. Okay? Or we might say Congress made a law. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, actually it was the House of Representatives proposed a bill, it passed, and went to the Senate for approval. So there's different groups involved, but we know what we mean when we say the House of Representatives, the Senate, the Congress. We know what we mean by those things. So they use the word Sanhedrin in a similar way. So there is the full Sanhedrin, all of the assembly. So like we would say the Congress, 435 representatives and 100 senators. So we know the Congress is 535 members. Sometimes you might hear somebody use the word Congress and they mean the House of Representatives, which is only 435 members. Or they say Congress did this. Well, not everybody voted for it. Some people voted against it, but Congress did it. So, we still use those terminologies that way ourselves, but we know what we mean when we say those things. They knew what they meant when they said Sanhedrin as the whole Sanhedrin or little Sanhedrins. Okay? So that's the first one, is the assembly of the leaders is the Sanhedrin. So, you got to remember that for these people at this time, there was no difference between a religious leader and a political leader. There's no difference. Because the political leaders are all about establishing God's kingdom here on earth. Well, that's a very religious thing to say. So there's no difference. So when we talk about somebody being a leader in the Sanhedrin, well, they're both a political leader and a religious leader. The number one leader of all of them is the high priest. And we talked about the high priest briefly last week, that he can't be disfigured. Remember that? So there's very specific things in the law what the high priest is supposed to do, who can be the high priest. So the high priest is the number one leader of the Sanhedrin. Okay, so he's the top cheese. Okay, from the years, I want to say 18 to 37, that's Caiaphas. Okay, so you see Caiaphas' name. He's the high priest from 18 AD to 37 AD. So at the time of Jesus' death and resurrection, it's Caiaphas. He's the son-in-law of a guy named Annas, A-N-N-A-S, who was the high priest from 6 to 15 AD. But all of his sons and his son-in-law all took their turns as being high priest. Because being high priest is something that you have to have the right genealogy to be the high priest. It's not just an elected thing like anybody can be the president of the United States who was born in the United States. You have to be of the royal family. You have to be of that family in order to be the high priest. So Caiaphas and Annas were part of that family, and Annas made sure that his sons. Now, here's the thing about the high priest. Who's really in charge? The Romans, right? We said that. The Romans are really in charge. So the Romans have the high priest in their hip pocket. Because you ain't no high priest unless we tell you you're the high priest. Because we're in charge. But to keep peace, we'll let you keep the title, we'll let you do the things the high priest is supposed to do, but we want you to know that we're really in charge. Okay? One of the interesting things about that is when the high priest goes into the temple once a year, to the Holy of Holies, he can only go in once a year, and that's to offer the sacrifice. Okay? He has to wear special things. Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, talks about what the high priest is supposed to wear when he goes in to offer the sacrifice. So he puts on the robes and things he's supposed to put on. He goes in and offers the sacrifice. When he comes out and he takes the robes off, he surrenders them to the Romans. They keep them locked up for the whole rest of the year until next year when it comes around again. This is one of the ways they have control. Because if they decide not to give the high priest the robes, he can't go in and make the sacrifice he's supposed to make. And the whole Jewish religion at that point shuts down. Okay? So the Romans keep in the Fortress Antonia the vestments that the high priest wears that day, so they have power over the high priest.
So in the passage where they talk about they ripping the robe.
We'll get to that.
You're gonna get to
Hold on. Put a pin in it. We're going to get there. Yes. Same question?
No. Now, were the priests all from
There's 2 kinds of priests. There's a Levitical priest, and then there's the ordained priest.
Okay.
He comes from the line of the Levites.
Okay.
So just like Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist was part of the family. He was a lower level part of the family, but he was part of the family, so he shares in the priesthood too. Okay, the Levitical priesthood. So that's the high priest, but there's also the chief priest. The chief priest just means out of all these other priests, besides the high priest, like Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, there was some that were considered more important than others. You know, so you've got the high priest, you've got some chief priests, the ones that are like big shot priests, and then you got the little shot priests, people like me. So the chief priest means those who are part of the priestly class, they're part of the priestly group, they're part of the leadership, but they are not the high priest. Okay? So remember, you got the high priest, you got some chief priests, and you got other priests.
Are there representatives from all of those in the Sanhedrin?
We're going to talk about that in just a second, too. Yes. Yes?
So did the Romans ever withhold the robes so that they couldn't go back in?
I don't know if that's ever been recorded. I've never come across that, but I do know. It's the same thing going on today for anybody who's been to the Holy Land. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, the keys are held in the hands of the Muslims. Because remember, the Ottoman Turks were in charge of the Holy Land at one time. They gave the keys to the Muslims. So the use of the church, even though it's an Orthodox church, it has a Catholic altar in it, it has a Syrian Orthodox altar in it, it has an Armenian altar in it. But the keys to get in the building are kept by the Muslims. So if the Muslims would choose, they could lock the building and say, we're not letting anybody in. There's a whole complicated reason why that is. So there's something like that still today. You can't go into that church unless the Muslims say you can go into the church. Just like the high priest couldn't go and offer the sacrifice unless he got the robes, and he couldn't get the robes unless the Romans gave them to him.
So like, going back to then, would the Romans ever withhold their ability to have that sacrifice as a means of?
That's what she just asked.
But I'm just saying, it's like, it's kind of keep them to behave themselves?
Well, they could do it that way, but you know what that could also produce? It could also produce a riot. So, yeah, so it's a very delicate political maneuver if you're going to decide to do that. Because it could backfire on you. Okay, so let's see, we were talking about the chief priests, the high priest. Then you got the scribes and the elders. The scribes is a specific group of people. These are all Pharisees. Okay, so now I need to talk about that. So, we talked about people being in the House of Representatives, the Senate. They're all in the Congress, right? There's committees. Some of those people in there are Republicans. Some of those people are Democrats. Some of those people are independents, right? So it's not automatically that Republicans become the Senate and Democrats become the House. It's not like that, right? You've got House members that are Republicans and Democrats. You've got Senate members that are Republicans and Democrats, and independents mixed in throughout, right? Same thing goes on with this. So the Sanhedrin is made up of people who have different roles, like high priests, chief priests, scribes, and elders. But they come from different parties, if you will, within the religion. We'll talk about those different parties in just a second. So the scribes are all members of the Pharisee group. Okay? These are people who are well versed in the law. They can write legal documents. They know how to interpret the laws. And when I say the law, please don't hear laws. Hear Torah. The first 5 books of the Bible, what we call the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's the law. Okay, that's the law of Moses. So when I say the law, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about laws like, don't run a stoplight. So you got the scribes. So these are people who are well versed in the laws, but they belong to the Pharisee, always belong to the Pharisee group, because those are really the experts in the law. The elders could be just anybody who's a big shot, regardless of what party they belong to. Okay? So scribes are always Pharisees, but elders just means leaders of the various groups. Okay, so it's a generic term. It doesn't mean a specific group of people. It just means anyone who's a leader in their group. Those are the elders. Okay?
But of a priestly class?
No, not necessarily.
Okay.
No, not at all.
So Nicodemus is probably an elder?
Nicodemus would probably be, he might be a scribe. Wait, Nicodemus. Could be an elder, not necessarily. Joseph of Arimathea, yeah, Nicodemus probably was, yeah. I would say he was probably a scribe. He was probably somebody well versed in the law, one of the elders among the Pharisees, and same with Joseph of Arimathea. Okay. All right, now you have these political parties or religious divisions. So just like we would say we have Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants, in those days they had Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots. Okay, now remember, these are not political distinctions necessarily. These are religious distinctions first. The politics shows what they believe about the religion. Okay? So the Sanhedrin is made up of members that are Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes and Zealots. Some of the Pharisees are scribes, but not all of them. There's elders in each of these groups that are part of the Sanhedrin. The high priest and the chief priests were always Sadducees. We'll talk about that in just a second. Okay? So think of these as roles. Think of these as parties that they belong to, or sects, S-E-C-T-S, that they belong to. Just like I could have put up here, Congress House, or Speaker of the House, Senate Majority Leader, Senate Minority Leader, House Whips. I could have put that all in here, right? Then I could say, well, then there's these people who were congressional aides, and these were party leaders of the Republican Party and Democrat parties. But then these are the different parties. Okay? It's kind of similar to that. So these are more like roles. These are groups that they belong to. And from these groups, they might be elected to become these other things. Okay? Make some sense? Okay. Differences here. All goes back to how they interpret God's revelation. The Pharisees, believe it or not, those were the liberals. Okay? We don't use that word that way today. when we say somebody's being Pharisaic. But these were the liberals. They said the law is for everybody. Everybody gets to benefit from the law, and so everybody has to follow the law. So these are the people who would say that everybody, well, when I say everybody, sorry ladies, the men. Because the men are part of the covenant, not the ladies. But the Pharisees would have said all the men should follow all of the law. They would also say that the law isn't just limited to those first 5 books, which is the law, Torah, but they would also say the wisdom literature, wisdom, Sirach, Psalms, Proverbs, all of that is divine inspired too. They would say the prophetic books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and all the minor prophets, those should be listened to. All the historical books, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. They would say that all of that, all 46 books of the Old Testament, should be paid attention to. Okay? That's what the Pharisees said, and everybody should follow the law. Everybody should, it's meant for everyone. That's what makes them liberal. Okay? It's meant for everybody, not just restricted to certain people. Okay? That's the Pharisees. Incidentally, they're the ones that believe in life after death. Jesus most certainly belonged to the Pharisee group. Okay? Then you got the Sadducees. The Sadducees are the priestly class. Because they're the priestly class, their thought is, no, the law is only meant for us. Because we're the priests. We're the ones that participate in the law. We're the ones that are bound to the law. The rest of you people, you can do whatever you want. Okay? But the law is restricted to us. We're the only ones that get to benefit from it. We're the only ones that have to follow it. Okay? And that law is not the 46 books, but just the Torah, just the first 5 books of the Bible. They don't consider anything else revelation, just those 5 books. Everything else is commentary. It's interesting to read, might be helpful to you spiritually, but you don't have to follow any of that stuff. Just Torah. Okay? They, interestingly enough, do not believe in the life after death because they don't understand that life after death is talked about in Torah. They say it's not because it doesn't directly say anything about heaven or hell or purgatory or anything about life after death, specifically in Torah. So they say there is no life after death. So they can't live on forever in heaven, which makes them sad, you see. Thank you, very much. Don't forget to tip the waiters. So, thank you very much. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Essenes are somewhere between a monastery and a commune. These are people who ditched town completely because they thought, remember, these are all religious groups. Their view was nobody was following the law the way it was supposed to be followed in Jerusalem or in the cities, so they went out into the hills and lived on their own, away from everybody else, and lived what they thought was a strict adherence to the law that nobody else was keeping. The thought is that John the Baptist probably belonged to the Essenes. They kind of died off. Oh wait, going back a second. Sadducees is all about the temple worship, right? All about following the law and the sacrifices. These are the priestly class. They don't exist anymore. They don't exist since 70 AD. What happened in 70 AD? The temple's gone. No temple, no sacrifice. No sacrifices, you don't need priests. So the Sadducees ceased to exist in 70 AD. And they still don't exist today because there's still no temple. The Pharisees were more about oriented towards the synagogue. So Jesus is going to synagogues all the time. Why? Because he's a Pharisee. The Pharisees they don't offer sacrifices in synagogues. Sacrifice can only happen in the temple. They sit around and read the Torah, they read the scriptures, and they discuss them. That's what you do in a synagogue. Okay? So the Pharisees are the only one of these groups that still exists today. In fact, anybody you meet who says they're Jewish, they're part of the Pharisees. Because the only religion that exists in Judaism today is Pharisaic Judaism.
He said that St. John the Baptist was
Probably in the scene. Yeah, we're talking.
And his father was a Sadducee.
Correct.
Is it strange that?
Well, the young John the Baptist was just strange anyways. Gifted. in a strange way. So the Essenes, one of the things that they tried to move beyond was attachment to the body, including intercourse. So they kind of died off too, because they didn't reproduce. So they kind of died off. So remember, all these so far, religious, but how do you follow the law? The Zealots were people who said, we want to restore Israel to God's kingdom. Okay? We want it to be restored. We want the Romans gone because they're stopping us from being God's holy people. And so in their zeal for God and for the law, they said any means by which we get rid of the Romans is a good thing, including killing them, blowing them up, whatever means we have of getting rid of ourselves of the Romans would be a good thing, so that we can be the pure Israel that God wants us to be. So these are the Zealots. Okay? So you got the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots, all different ways of looking at God's law and living accordingly. Leaders from each of these groups became elders. The ones that were very versed in the law and good writers of law and things like interpreters of law, they become the scribes. The Sanhedrin is made up of the high priests, chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Make a little bit of sense? It's like I said, just when you read these, you say, they convene the chief priests. Well, who are the chief priests? Or the chief priests and the elders, So now we know when you see chief priests and elders, that means that some of the Sadducees, who are the leaders among the priestly class, and then leaders from the other groups are all gathering together. Okay? But it doesn't necessarily mean the entire big Sanhedrin, but that does form a small Sanhedrin, doesn't it? You got leaders from the different groups coming together with the high priest, that forms a little Sanhedrin. Okay? So I just think it's helpful when you're reading these passages to have an idea of who they're talking about. And it's an interesting thing. I think that Jesus rails on the Pharisees the most because he's one of them, and he expects so much more from them because they know all of the scriptures. And I think he expects more from them than he does from the other groups, and I think that's why he's disappointed so much with the Pharisees. That's my theory, for what it's worth.
Were all of them educated? So they could read and write?
The scribes, certainly. The high priest and the chief priests, probably. Well, the high priest, yes, the chief priest, probably. The elders may or may not have been. Because they were just leaders from the different groups. And so the Essenes might say, well, you go represent us in the Sanhedrin. So they weren't necessarily. Now, depending on their work, so people say James and John and Peter and Andrew, they were fishermen, okay? But they had to do business. They had to know how much money they were making. They had to know, what to charge people. They had to be able to communicate with people who didn't necessarily speak their language, So they had to be somewhat educated. And of course, all of them, to some degree, are educated in the scriptures. That's really all of them will be versed in the scriptures too. So they may not, have been reading Plato, but they certainly would have been reading the scriptures. Good question. Okay. Moving on to the reading for today. So I listed it as 3 sections here. The Jewish trial / interrogation, I'll talk about why in a second. I have both those words up there. Peter's denial and the death of Judas. In Matthew and Mark, these two things are distinct in the text. Luke is mixing them together, and John really mixes them all together. So they're going back. John's text is going back and forth like a club sandwich. It's going back and forth over and over again. Okay? I thought this was an interesting painting when I saw this in the Vatican Museum. It doesn't come out real clear on here, but it's 3 roosters representing the cock crowing 3 times when Peter denied the Lord, and the cock crowed 3 times. So I thought was an interesting painting. So I put that up there. So I'm going to talk first about the trial and interrogation. I'll talk then about the denials, and then I'll talk about the death of Judas. So Mark and Matthew mention Peter, then the trial, then Peter's denials. Okay, so they mention Peter, and then the trial, and they have all the denials. Luke has Peter's denial, then the trial and interrogation, and John has it all mixed together, as I said. So Mark and Matthew are almost identical. As you remember, you saw in the color coding on page 4, you see all of the green is what Matthew, Mark, and Luke have that's exactly the same, but all the blue is what Matthew and Mark have identical. So there's very little that Mark and Matthew don't have the same. Okay? So Mark and Matthew, Jesus is led to Caiaphas, the high priest, who's gathered with the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. So kind of like a baby Sanhedrin, right? They try to get testimony, but they can't find anything but false witnesses. So all these people are coming up and saying things like, well, I heard him say he was going to destroy the temple, and not talking about the metaphor, but that he was literally going to destroy the temple. Okay? At first, Jesus doesn't answer. If you want to see some interesting Old Testament references to this that happened hundreds of years before Jesus was born, you can turn to Isaiah 53:7. So Isaiah 53:7, he submitted and opened not his mouth. And Psalm 38, verses 13, 14, and 15. So those are just some interesting places. Isaiah is 500 years before the birth of Jesus. The Psalms are 1,000 years. But they're prophesying of what's going to happen to Jesus hundreds of years before Jesus is born. So Caiaphas is sitting there presiding over this because he's the high priest, right? So he's presiding over this. He's listening to all this false testimony. Nobody's giving him anything. What he wants is something he can use to get rid of Jesus. But nobody's giving him anything that he wants because they're giving him false testimony. He knows it's false and it's not going to be able to do him any good. So finally he has enough of it and he asks flat out. This is Mark and Matthew. Are you the Messiah, the Son of God? Matthew says the Blessed One. Mark says the Son of God. And Mark says, Jesus said, I am. And Matthew, in typical Matthew literary style, being a little more dramatic, you said so, and you will see me raised up in glory. So those are Mark and Matthew's answers. This is the part somebody asked me, about Caiaphas. So this is the part. So it says, Caiaphas tore his robes. Now, in English, it's difficult to understand necessarily, just in that moment, who the his is. Caiaphas tore Jesus' robes, his robes, or Caiaphas tore his own robes. And I've seen interpretations that point to both. Until you look at what's actually happening in the scene. So Caiaphas thinks that Jesus has blasphemed. Calling himself God, calling himself the Son of God. He's blasphemed against God. He has spoken falsely about God. There was in other literature of the time, we see signs when somebody suffers a grief that is a passionate, expressive grief, they tear their clothes. So a grief that's even greater than losing a loved one. A grief in which you can't respond. A grief that you can't even appreciate. When you experience a grief like that, you tear your robes. You tear your clothes. Okay? So the writer is telling us that Caiaphas is so offended by Jesus blaspheming that he tore his robes. So the author is telling us that something that Jesus said is causing so much grief for Caiaphas that he has to act out of his grief. Now, what's wrong with that? Go ahead, Carrie.
He needs those robes.
Well, yeah. No, these are not his vestments. These are his everyday clothes.
Okay.
What's the problem here? What does Caiaphas think is happening?
Oh.
Jesus is blaspheming. Is Jesus blaspheming?
No.
No, because he is the Son of God. But Caiaphas is so far from the truth that he's completely overwhelmed by what he thinks is blasphemy because he can't see the truth. And that's why he tears his robes.
So I don't think that it's not tearing Jesus' robes, because
Right.
by the time Jesus gets there, he's been beat up and, by the soldiers before he gets there. So I think his robes are already torn up.
Yeah, but as we'll see with the mocking that we'll get to next week, we'll see that there is still clothing that's on him. So, but yeah, but like I said, I saw people saying that he tore his robes because he was so upset with Jesus, he did that to Jesus, and it's like, that's not what's going on.
Is part of the problem that Caiaphas is a Sadducee and therefore does not believe in life after death, and Christ has been preaching all around the place about you're going to get he's preaching salvation, that you're going to get a reward in heaven.
Yeah, I think I think part of it is a spiritual issue. I think part of it is a jealousy issue. That Jesus is becoming more popular than the high priests, and the chief priests are becoming, and I think there's a whole lot of things going on there. But that's part of it. Okay, Mark also has the bystanders mocking Jesus and the guards striking him. Interestingly, Matthew has the Sanhedrin. The leaders of the Jewish people are the ones that are doing the mocking. Interesting. If we presume that Mark was written first, Mark tells us that bystanders, hangers out, roadies, groupies, whatever, they're just kind of hanging out there, and they're the ones mocking Jesus. Matthew changes it to the Sanhedrin doing it. Now again, remember Matthew. Matthew is writing to a community of people who are Christians, who used to be Jews, that are being persecuted by the Jews. And so Matthew has reason to make the Sanhedrin look really bad, doesn't he? Because they are bad. In his time, later, that he's writing his gospel, they are bad. They're persecuting us. So that's Mark and Matthew. So Luke, all of this happens at daybreak. Presumably, all this in Mark and Matthew is happening still the night of the arrest. But in Luke, it's happening at daybreak. And who's present? The chief priests, the scribes, the Sanhedrin. Not the whole Sanhedrin, the baby Sanhedrin. They say to Jesus, if you're the Messiah, tell us. He doesn't answer. But he, like typical fashion for Jesus, he doesn't answer the questions being asked. He answers what he wants to answer. He doesn't say yes or no to the question they ask, are you the Messiah? But he says, you will see me raised in glory. That'll be your answer. So that's what Luke gives us. John, interestingly enough, doesn't give us a formal trial at all, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke does. Just mockery and no verdict. So there's the mockery, but there's no verdict. So unlike Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where the blaspheming of Jesus is declared, John doesn't have that. Because John doesn't have a trial. In fact, John, for the most part, he's not having a trial before Caiaphas, so he's having a trial before Annas, the father-in-law of the high priest, the former high priest. Somebody asked me, well, why do they call him the high priest? I said, the same reason we call Jimmy Carter and Donald Trump Mr. President. Because once you're president, you're always called Mr. President after that. So the same thing, the high priest in their time. So yes, Caiaphas was the high priest, but Annas had been the high priest, and so we call him the high priest. But he wasn't the high priest at that time. Caiaphas was. And notice what Annas is asking about. There's no false testimony issues here. There's no, are you the Messiah question that's at first. What's he asking about? He's asking about his disciples and his doctrine. Now remember what we said about the synoptics versus John. What are the synoptics after? Painting a portrait for a community of who Jesus is, what he said, what he did. John is written a little bit later to refute false teachings. So John's whole gospel is oriented towards making sure people know the right teachings. So what's Annas asking Jesus about? His teachings. Big surprise in John? No. Because that's what John's concerned with. Okay? So Annas is asking about his disciples and about his teachings. He's asking him questions about those things. Because that's what John is trying to get across. That Jesus, and what does he say? He says, I spoke publicly to the world. So ask the people who heard me, they'll know what I said. Because I've been preaching openly and teaching about God, calling people to belief and repentance. And that's what Jesus has been doing for the whole gospel of John up to this point. So it's a different sense of what's going on here. That's why I put trial/interrogation. Because in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it tends to look more like a trial. But where in John it looks like more just a questioning. And again, there's no verdict, there's no conclusion of verdict or anything like that in John. So Peter's denial. Mark and Matthew have Peter following, and in the courtyard we saw that monument marking the spot where Peter had denied Jesus. They both have the maid saying, "You were with him," Peter denying it, and then Mark has the cock crowing. In Mark, the same girl asks a second time. And Matthew, it's a different girl the second time, saying he was with him, and Peter denying again. So Mark has the same person asking twice. Matthew has two different people asking. Interesting thing, Peter denies it again. The bystanders say, so now it's the third group of people, challenging Peter. "You are one of them. We can tell by your Galilean speech." If you don't know the geography of the land, Israel, think of Israel as a long strip. You got Galilee in the north. Nazareth is in Galilee. The Lebanon is up here, the Golan Heights. Then you've got Samaria in the middle, and then you've got Judea and Jerusalem and Bethlehem are in Judea. Okay? The northern folks, the Galileans, were the hillbillies. Okay? They were not the city dwellers. That was the Judeans. Okay? But they're the hillbillies. They're the country bumpkins. Okay? And so it says, we know you're a Galilean, even your speech gives you away, because you talk like this. I don't know how they taught Galileans.
I don't know, he's from the north.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be like that.
It wouldn't be like that. Drop the R's instead.
Yeah.
Huber. I was in Boston. My sister and I were taking one of those tours, and the guy was giving the tour. We were going past like the Harvard section of Boston. He said, "How hot it is to pocket cod, Harvard." Drop every R in the sentence. So maybe that's how the Galileans talk. Peter denies 3 times, and the cock crows immediately, and Peter weeps. Interesting, if you look at the text of Mark very carefully, what you'll see is an escalating denial. His denials are getting worse each time in Mark. The first one, it's just evasive. He kind of avoids the question, but it's private, it's one-on-one. The second one, it's evasive again, he avoids the answering the question. Now there's a crowd, so he's avoiding it in front of a crowd now, which is worse. And then finally, the third time, he explicitly and publicly says, "I don't know." So Mark's Peter is getting worse each time. Now, what do we say about Matthew and how he deals with the apostles? The Christian community he's writing to is struggling to stay together and be a community. He wants them to have confidence in their leadership. Who are the leaders? The bishops. Who are the bishops? The successors of the apostles. So he doesn't have the apostles look bad in his gospel. He cleans up the apostles compared to Mark. Okay? And so Matthew doesn't have Peter looking as bad and having him more repentant as well. Because he has to make Peter look good because Peter's the leader of the church. And I need the church to have confidence in their leaders. Luke agrees with Mark and Matthew about the courtyard, the maid accusing, Peter denying, someone else accusing, Peter denying again, the Galilean speech as evidence, Peter denying a third time, and the cock crowing. But the one detail he adds in here that's really interesting is that icon that I showed you. When Jesus' hands are tied and Peter and Jesus are looking at each other, when he denies Jesus the third time, he tells us that Peter and Jesus' eyes met. Can you imagine the grief in Peter's heart when he saw Jesus look at him as he was denying him, that he even knows him? It's very profound. And so Luke captures that, says that Peter weeps bitterly. John, for his part, the maid accuses, Peter denies. The bystanders then accuse, Peter denies again. The slave accuses, and Peter denies, and the cock crows. So you do see the 3 times in all 4 Gospels. You do see Peter denying 3 times. You see the maid. The first one is always the maid. Then there's bystanders. things like that. Okay. And then the death of Judas. If you notice on page 5, page 6, it's only in Matthew. This does not exist in Mark, Luke, or John. It's only in Matthew. It is referenced, however, in Acts chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. Now, what's the significance of that? Who wrote Acts of the Apostles? Luke. Okay? So St. Luke is associated with St. Paul. St. Luke wasn't there, but he does hear the apostles talking about it in his time. So he does hear the apostles talking about Judas and what happened to Judas.